Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dan Wild from Harding Evans. I head up the employment team at Harding Evans and have been advising on employment law issues for longer than I care to remember, but I qualified as a solicitor over 25 years ago, and throughout that time scale I've been specialising in helping employers and navigate the world of employment law. And today obviously we're talking about issues that arise from COVID and the transition back to work, which has started a little earlier in England than in Wales. The issues that we're going to touch upon today are the potential liabilities for employees who contract coronavirus, looking at some of the legal framework that touches upon health and safety within England and Wales, slightly comparing the situation between England and Wales as it currently stands, and just looking at some of the legal some of the legislation that businesses will need to consider. Obviously, there's only so much that we can cover in one webinar. Look at some of the issues arising about opening some workplaces safely, and consider some of the more thorny issues such as employees refusing to return to work, managing the requirements of those who are more vulnerable and or those who live with those who are more vulnerable, considering some of the issues around managing the health of workers, and looking at some of the issues around who can return to work problems and pitfalls. It's likely that for many people, some things won't change immediately. Government guidance in both England and Wales still remains that if you can work from home, you should, and that particularly for those of us who work in office-based environments, it's likely that return to work is still going to involve a significant amount of working from home. The requirements of social distancing are likely to mean that workplaces are unable to be able to accommodate more than a certain percentage of the workforce returning at any one time. And also there's the real potential, particularly as the circumstances in Leicester show, that at any time a number of the workforce may be asked to isolate at relatively short notice, particularly if the government gets track and trace working efficiently. Certainly the government's coronavirus response strategies for the foreseeable future, workers should continue to work from home rather than a normal physical workplace wherever possible. This will help minimise the number of social contacts across the country and therefore keep transmissions as low as possible. All workers who cannot work from home shall travel to work if their workplace is open. And we have to view that in the context of the growing body of science that indicates that the highest risk locations for spreading COVID are enclosed spaces where multiple people interact. For example, traditional office spaces, public transport, pubs and nightclubs, seemingly food processing factories, particularly in the north of Wales. And so there obviously is a balance between the government's wish to get the economy back functioning normally and getting people off furlough, and businesses ensuring that they can operate safely with due regard to their statutory obligations. And obviously one of the things that we will touch upon today is the need for employers to fundamentally review their workplace risk assessments, which I would imagine few, if any, traditionally would have been drafted to account for the type of pandemic that we've really encountered since March. So looking really at the legal frameworks that we are working within at present, there's a variety of issues that businesses need to consider. We've got specific health protection regulations with separate regulations both in England and Wales, with England being slightly ahead of the curve in terms of reopening up shops and retail, which I think obviously happened or is starting to happen in Wales last week, with England having started beforehand. Obviously, technically still in Wales, we're not supposed to be travelling more than 5 miles away for anything other than sort of essential work-related travel. So although shops are open, for example, in Cardiff, technically individuals shouldn't be travelling more than 5 miles to visit non-essential shops. We have different provisions now relating to social distancing, with England having moved to 1 metre, whereas in Wales the requirement still is that there is a statutory obligation that wherever practicable employees should be socially distancing 2 metres apart. So we do have a dichotomy between the English and Welsh positions with slightly different provisions applying in Scotland. I'm pretty confident that we don't have anybody from Scotland joining this webinar today. And then we have health and safety legislation and employers' obligations to provide safe working environments. And we have employment legislation, in particular legislation relating to discrimination law. And I suppose also we could overlay across that as well, general data protection regulations in relation to the processing of personal data. So there's quite a lot of legal issues that businesses do currently need to be considering at present. And obviously we've only got 45 minutes or so to talk about some of these issues today. So really, this is more about flagging issues rather than providing absolute detailed legal advice, which obviously I'm very much hoping that you will come and talk to me about if required. One of the questions that we've been asked is, could a business be liable if an employee contracts coronavirus at work? The answer to that question is potentially yes. The practical issues that would be associated with that, the employee would have to prove it was exposure at work that led to them falling ill, and it would also have to establish that the employer was negligent in its approach to managing that COVID risk. Now, I would imagine in many sort of working environments, it's going to be quite difficult to establish that it was exposure at work that led to the employee falling ill. I could think of possibly some notable exceptions, possibly with the food processing factories, where large percentages of employees who have come down with COVID in the past couple of weeks may be a possible exception. But even then, the employer has to establish that the employer has been negligent in its approach to managing the risk. An employer isn't necessarily going to be liable because an employee was exposed to COVID in the workplace. It's only if the employer has failed to take reasonable measures to protect its employees. One of the critical factors in terms of mitigating risk is the need for employers to undertake thorough and detailed corona risk assessments, ideally in consultation with its workforce or its trade unions where a trade union is recognised. Now, if anybody's any experience of writing or drafting risk assessments, or certainly proper risk assessments, everybody will probably appreciate they are far longer than being written on the back of a cigarette packet. They're usually quite long documents and sometimes are not necessarily easily digestible. So you may well need to produce an abridged issue/summary for your employees. And the whole purpose of a risk assessment is really to establish what is the risk and how you can mitigate that risk to keep your workforce safe. And certainly in the current climate, perhaps more so than at any other time, you need to be shown what you are doing to your workforce, what is being done to keep them safe. And certainly there should be a proper communication plan with your employees in relation to these important health and safety issues. And it should be a dialogue really to try and make the return to work process as safe as possible. So you would need to, at the very least, to show the risks that are identified and explain what is being done to minimise the risks of transmission of COVID within the workplace. Obviously, the government has issued guidance on COVID secure workplaces. I mean, the first step obviously is setting the risk assessments with a view to setting up safe systems of work and implementing them. Employers will need to be considering a strict code of measures, potentially including observing the 1 metre rule in England of social distancing. Though I think I would be suggesting to employers that wherever possible, they should be trying to maintain 2 metres social distancing. In Wales, we have a slightly stringent and more stringent legal requirement to take all reasonable steps to ensure social distancing at the 2 metre level within the workplace. I mean, there are potential exceptions, but certainly the legal requirement is to take all reasonable steps wherever possible. And for example, that might include, I obviously know, work office-based workplaces better than perhaps I do retail and factories. But certainly, for example, employers should be considering one-way systems to minimise contact within the workplace. For example, here at our offices, we're identifying separate entrances for staff. We are undertaking frequent cleaning of objects and communal areas. We are trying to set up, wherever possible, workplace bubbles, so people are interacting where they are in the office, and the majority of our staff are working from home, that only a small number of people potentially come in to interact with a relatively small group of people, and it's the same group of people where they do interact, so potentially you mitigate the risk of transmission. Employers are certainly going to need to be considering personal protective equipment and screen protections for staff. For example, we have some fairly substantial perspex screens now in our reception area for when we do eventually reopen the office to clients. And for those of you who've recently been out to the shops, you'll be seeing perspex screens and potentially PPE being worn by retail staff. It was particularly noticeable. I had to go into Next with my teenage daughter who'd sprung about a foot during lockdown to buy her new clothes. And it was very noticeable that staff within Next were wearing quite sort of visors and with screens in front of the tills. Within retail, for example, another environments in which potentially goods may be returned, organisations will need to be considering storing returned items for 72 hours as they are potentially contaminated before returning them to the shop or warehouse, whatever it may be. And certainly where pubs and restaurants are going to potentially open within the leisure sector, currently in England on the 4th of July, it's going to be table service only, with venues possibly expected to collect contact details of customers for the NHS test and trace system. This is just to give you a flavour of the type of measures across a range of sectors that you'll need to consider. And obviously for factory workplaces and construction workplaces, then businesses are going to need to be considering the COVID secure guidance that's been issued for their particular sectors. One of the other questions is PPE, will I have to provide it? I mean, there's no short answer to this question. It's a question that you'll have to consider as part of your risk assessments for your particular type of business. If it's required or identified as being necessary under your risk assessments for certain roles, then you are legally required to provide it. Certainly the guidance, is generally preferring wherever possible social distancing, but obviously there are certain types of business, private dental practice, orthodontic practices, to the extent that they're able to reopen, and clearly social distancing isn't necessarily going to be possible. But medical grade PPE, obviously if you're going to provide PPE, it's got to work. Medical grade PPE should be restricted to roles where there are no other ways possible to mitigate the risk of transmission of COVID. So really, I think that the kind of summary is that PPE is probably a last resort, but if you are going to provide it, you must ensure it works as expected, provide appropriate training for your staff in using PPE. I'm sure there's lots of YouTube videos out there showing people how not to use PPE, and you're going to make sure what you supply actually fits each member of staff properly. So it's not really stuff that you can just provide and say that you've complied with your legal duties. Certainly the requirements are more stringent than that. One of the other questions I've been asked is, do we have a duty of care towards the mental health of our workers? And certainly, of course, for the last few months, many individuals have either not been in work or working from home. There will be lots of anxieties and worries, and certainly in the way in which businesses communicate and deal with their staff, employees are perhaps going to have to exercise their duty of care perhaps more stringently in this regard perhaps otherwise. And certainly there's a need to consider employees' well-being, and there's certainly a number of issues that I certainly would be recommending that businesses are considering. For example, have workloads increase, as for example many businesses have had staff on furlough. Has that imposed a greater burden upon other members of staff, either in terms of workload, mental strain? Have the intellectual demands of work changed in view of COVID? And are the demands being made on some employees more unreasonable compared to the demands being made upon others? I mean, certainly some of the issues that we've been considering as we start to manage our employees' transition back to the workplace, when that eventually starts to happen, is we've set up a counselling service for a finite period of time, really to assist our staff address their worries and concerns about returning to the workplace. And obviously we've done stuff as well in terms of our communication plan and what we've communicated to our staff in terms of how what we've done to try and ensure the safety. I'm going to just touch quickly upon health and safety enforcement. Certainly there have been concerns about whether the health and safety executive might be inspecting workplaces. I think on balance it's probably fairly unlikely, just for the sheer logistics of the fact that the health and safety executive and local authorities just don't have the resources to conduct an inspection or investigation of more workplaces. I mean, coronavirus itself is only likely to lead to reports if an unintended incident has led to possible or actual exposure to coronavirus, and where there's likely serious illness or death as a result of exposure to coronavirus, and there's reasonable evidence that it arises from exposure at work. So, if a worker did die as a result of occupational exposure to coronavirus, then it may potentially be reportable, and there may be circumstances in which that might meet the criteria for investigation. If it could be established that the death arose from a preventable work-related cause, or where there was a likelihood of serious breaches of health and safety. But certainly in terms of proactive inspections of workplace, this is probably going to be limited to the highest risk premises, perhaps the food processing outlets. Now we've seen localised outbreaks of coronavirus around certain food processing centres, then they may be possibly subject to inspection. Or if there was perhaps businesses that were playing a flagrant disregard to the health and safety and well-being, and perhaps if there was whistleblowing to the health and safety executive and local authority, then there may be certain situations that might be proactive inspections. Now, this next slide is really intended to deal with the situation where we might have a circumstance in which somebody might become ill in your workplace. And although thankfully the incidence of coronavirus has been on a steady decline through May and June from its peak, it's still out there. We've still got hundreds of people sadly dying each week, and we still have new cases arising. So it could potentially, somebody could be diagnosed within your workplace or have been in contact with someone in your workplace. So, employers have got to balance their obligations and data protection, confidentiality obligations. You can't necessarily go around saying that Joe Bloggs has had coronavirus, so you guys all need to be careful. You're going to have to think quite carefully how you communicate and process data relating to coronavirus, taking into account that the fact that health data is sensitive data. Obviously you've got to balance that you're against your duty of care to make sure that your employees are kept notified and are kept safe. So wherever possible, you don't reveal more information than is necessary. For example, not naming colleagues who've had to self-isolate. there may be implications that could arise from track and trace. We can't really negate those risks. So certainly you're going to need to consider, really, as you process information that's communicated to you in terms of employees either having a positive diagnosis or being told that they've had to self-isolate in consequence of being in contact with somebody who's had a positive diagnosis, how you communicate with your workforce and the extent to which you process and communicate that personal data to the wider workforce. I've certainly been asked questions about whether employers can impose requirements to kind of do temperature checks, was the one that I had, in terms of individuals coming into the workplace. Now that's obviously going to involve processing of some sensitive personal data, and there are some ramifications of that. Now, given that the guidance isn't really, unlike some other countries, saying to businesses that you should undertake those temperature checks, it may be difficult to justify imposing temperature checks. Now, employers may be willing to voluntarily agree to them. The practical issue may come if somebody says, I really don't want you to do that, and you want to treat that as a breach of a reasonable instruction. There's certainly going to be difficult potential issues to address there between, trying to impose a requirement consistently across your workforce and the fact that there isn't really a mandatory guideline saying that employees should be undertaking their own temperature checks. So that's potentially a difficult issue, and certainly if it's something that you are really wanting to do, I think really you need to sort of stop and think and possibly take some advice from me as to how you might implement that and the risks and pros and cons. And clearly, if everybody in your workforce is willing to buy into that, it's a different ballgame. But you always have to account to the fact that in life, some people may be difficult, no matter how hard you are trying. The fact that you're trying to do it to keep everybody safe. Really interesting issues, or potentially challenging issues, is can workers refuse to come into work or leave a workplace if they think it's unsafe? Now, there are statutory provisions within the Employment Rights Act, which, it has to be said, have been very rarely litigated, but employees are protected, for example, from detriments, for example, loss of pay or dismissal if they leave or refuse to attend the workplace for health and safety reasons. And it's important to recognise this is a day one right. It doesn't require 2 years service. And certainly there's been no cases in this context around a pandemic situation. So it's really hard to ascertain the strength of the right in the current circumstances. The practical issue is that if an employee has been dismissed because of taking a protected action under Section 100 of the Employment Rights Act relating to raising concerns about health and safety not attending the workplace, the compensatory award for dismissals uncapped. So if you don't take seriously this right, employers potentially themselves open to potentially significant financial penalties. Also, if you raise a concern about health and safety, it could be a protected disclosure for the purposes of the whistleblowing protection as well. When you're considering the protections under these particular sections of the Employment Rights Act, the key issue is whether an employee's belief that a workplace is unsafe was reasonable at the time when the employee made that decision. It doesn't really matter what the employer's view is, nor whether the working environment complied with health and safety standards. And the fact that one employee is willing to work does not negate the belief of another that there is an imminent danger. And of course, at the current time, we've had we've had months of press headlines around the dangers and risks of coronavirus and people dying. And so we're going to have, in some cases, quite nervous and quite anxious employees. So really, this is where it comes down to you as employers taking appropriate action by making sure that you've done everything that you can in terms of your risk assessments, putting in place measures to protect the health and safety of your staff, and more importantly, communicating these really well to your staff and indicating to staff that they can raise concerns at any stage or ask questions at any stage in relation to the measures that you have put in place. I mean, certainly making your risk assessments or an abridged version of that available to your staff will enable employees to see that your decisions have taken into account how to mitigate the risks of coronavirus, and proof of a good communication strategy and documented decision making will, of course, help if you need to defend yourself if claims do arise. I mean, if an employee says that they're refusing to work or want to leave work because they think it's dangerous, you really need to have to investigate whether this view is reasonable before you decide how to proceed. If the refusal was reasonable to make, though mistaken in the facts, you will need to communicate with your employees to make sure they understand your risk assessments. At the same time, if there are effective compromises, then alternative forms of working should be considered and agreed, even if you don't think it's strictly necessary for health and safety reasons. I mean, again, there's also elements that you've got a broad obligation to take practical measures to support the mental health and well-being of your workers, and to consider whether any flexible working requests should be considered. And if an employee disagrees with the effort you make to give them confidence that they'll be working in a safe environment and refuses an instruction to work in a particular way, you need to be think quite carefully and take advice before you decide whether to commence disciplinary action. I said we'll be offering a period of unpaid leave as an alternative to dismissal. I mean, I certainly think that employers should be very slow to consider disciplinary action dismissal after the last 3 or 4 months. Is it your responsibility to take into account the risks involved in travelling to work, in particular on public transport? I mean, the answer to this question isn't entirely clear. I mean, health and safety legislation, regulations have always held employers accountable for the working environments in which they ask their employees to operate in. And certainly employment law protections, such as the ones that I've just mentioned, were designed to protect those who did not want to expose themselves to danger while at work. It is possible, but I tend to think unlikely, that the courts may decide that an employer's general duty of care does stretch to considering the public health risks associated with using public transport. I don't think that's absolutely the way that they will go, but it's a possibility. I certainly think the safest way that you can, safest approach in terms of minimising the risk of litigation and to manage your employees' concerns is to strictly follow the government's guidance in this area. And at the minute, the government is still asking people to use public transport only if it's absolutely necessary. So again, that comes back to, does your employee actually need to be working in the workplace, or could they do the work at home? But if employees must come into work and would normally use public transport to do so, then I certainly think that employers are best should consider how to minimise the risk of exposure to coronavirus, which could include managing and staggering start times, considering different hours of work, opening your workplaces for longer hours to enable the times that employees attend and travel to be staggered, or even if it's possible, and it isn't possible for every industry sector, to have a mix of workplace working and home-based working. Possibly again it comes down to the type of organisation, considering rotating attendance, and particularly considering helping those that are vulnerable, which we will talk about shortly. Another question, and actually we've had this more than in our workplace, and certainly some people have clamoured more loudly than others: can staff demand to come into work? Now, you're certainly not required to reopen to accommodate where your staff can work from home, and certainly at the current time, my view is that staff is that where the guidance is that where your staff can work from home, they should. You're not really obliged to make available your workplaces. You're certainly going to have to consider whether you should allow the clinically extremely vulnerable to return to work even if they actually want to. And certainly it's an issue that we've had with some of our very committed staff here. I mean, I think that all I can say in this respect is that individuals cannot take responsibility from their employers for their own health and safety by agreeing in writing even to waive their employer's responsibility to safeguard them. And so I think employers are going to have to consider very carefully as to whether or not they allow those who are certainly within the most vulnerable class, those that are clinically extremely vulnerable, whether they can be allowed to return to work. So obviously you're going to need to make yourself familiar with those who the government defines as being extremely clinically vulnerable, as opposed to those that are simply clinically vulnerable. In relation to vulnerable workers, I mean, the guidance is that the clinically vulnerable should work from home if they can, but if they cannot work at home, they can return. You need to take extra care with social distancing and will need to be offered the safest available on-site roles that enable social distancing. And certainly for those staff, I would be thinking very seriously about this if with the different rules that apply in England as opposed to Wales with 1 metre social distancing, I don't think that really suffices for those that might be classed as clinically vulnerable. The guidance in relation to the extremely clinically vulnerable is that they are still strongly advised not to work outside the home. So in my view, really should not yet return to work. I mean, you as organisations, I mean, most of the individuals that potentially fall in either category here are likely to be individuals who fall within the disability provisions of the Equality Act, and there will be obligations to make reasonable adjustments to facilitate working, in particular home working. And then finally, to touch upon, is it reasonable for a worker to refuse to come into the office because they live with a clinically vulnerable person? From a legal perspective, probably not, though we yet to see really how employment tribunals will deal with any cases that arise post-coronavirus. In general, employers are not responsible for those who live with their workers, and obviously we could be talking dependents, we could be talking partners and spouses here. The government guidance says that those living with a person in shielding can leave the home, and that social distancing should actually be practiced within the home, but does ask employers to be sensitive to the needs of those who live with vulnerable individuals. And obviously, you know, we're talking about issues obviously earlier in relation to mental health, and obviously employers could make a personal injury claim if they believe the employer has not done what is necessary to protect their mental health, and forcing employees to put themselves in a situation that they deem to be dangerous when there are other possible ways of working could be an avoidable cause of stress. So really, if employees do ask to work from home in such circumstances, this needs to be fully considered, and whereas compromise is possible, this opportunity should be taken. If it's not possible for the employee to continue to work at home, then the reasons for the decision should be clearly documented, and obviously comply with guidelines around how employers should deal with flexible working requests. And obviously this may become more difficult potentially with staff who are also furloughed, where you want to bring them back, particularly as furlough subsidies start to reduce from the 1st of August and into September and October, where the subsidy obviously reduces by 10 and 20%. And finally, some particular issues around pregnant workers. The government's guidance classes pregnant women as being clinically vulnerable rather than extremely clinically vulnerable. This means that those who are pregnant can be asked to attend a workplace, but businesses have always had and must assess the specific risk to pregnant employees and do everything possible to prevent or remove them, which may include adapting their role to remove them from the highest risk situations and enabling them to work from home for the whole of the pregnancy. You'll need to discuss the risks with the pregnant worker and possible ways to mitigate them, and different women will have different views on what level of risk is acceptable. And while I remember, just be very careful with taking into account furlough in relation to furlough decisions, because if you've got somebody on furlough who might want to come back, but use the fact of pregnancy to justify keeping them on furlough because it wouldn't be safe for them to return to work, potential significant problems there, because you might end up with a discrimination claim. And what you could, the practical problem you have, if it isn't safe for them to return to work, you potentially would have to suspend them on medical grounds, which has always been the situation for pregnant women who can't work or be deployed to an alternative role because of dangers to pregnant women within the workplace. But if you medically suspend them, they have to be suspended on full pay. So potentially quite difficult issues. There may be some way of perhaps circumventing them if you do assess it's not safe to return, by topping up the individual's pay to 100% but keeping them on furlough. But certainly those issues I really think you need to be taking specific legal advice. And again, I hope that's from me. Again, workers and childcare commitments. Certainly schools still remain largely closed, with most pupils only really being able to go in at the very most 1 day per week. Many employee support networks, and we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that many employees rely either on childminders who are not working for whatever reasons relating to COVID, or in relation to very typically grandparents or other members of an extended family. And of course, those support networks may not be available to your employees at this time. Obviously, consider flexible working requests. Now, if you do have employees who just say we're simply not able to work or return to work at present, my strong view is that you should avoid draconian action, and you may possibly, to the extent the employee is not able to work at home, then possibly you need to be considering offering unpaid leave if the employee isn't able to return to work. Really, I think tribunals are going to take quite dim views of employers who take draconian action if employers have got a reasonable basis for not being able to return to work, particularly around childcare. Possibly issues some businesses may face about choosing who can or cannot return to work, particularly around where employees have been on furlough. Certainly when businesses put a lot of staff onto furlough, a lot of businesses did that quite urgently in March. Many employees were quite willing to go along with it as alarm levels started to raise amongst many people at the time. I've certainly got one client of mine at the minute who is facing a quite significant tribunal claim arising from the fact that they've taken into account the fact that the employee had health conditions that potentially amounted to a disability, and that member of staff was furloughed rather than being provided with the opportunity to return to work at home. There was lots of advice around about making decisions upon who to furlough, not taking into account issues such as pregnancy, health, etc. And all of those same points apply in terms of choosing who can return to work, especially as, particularly if you've got staff on furlough, you probably have more time to plan getting them back to work, or to consult with staff, or to design criteria to allow for a fair basis for choosing who does and who does not return to work, than perhaps when the race was to get as many people either off the payroll or working from home as soon as possible back in March. So what should you be doing about choosing who can and cannot return to work? Employers need to ascertain what workers and working practices need to be done in a specific location, and obviously all the risk assessment issues that we've already discussed. Employers will need to be considering consulting with their employees about who really wants to get back to work. If it isn't everybody that you currently need back at work, can you deal with it by way of volunteers only? What are your employees' concerns about returning to work? Setting up some sensible kind of rational criteria for determining who does come back to work. and that it's almost a little bit like a redundancy consultation and selection process, but in reverse about who can come back to work. I suppose that's the only way I can really describe what you may need to consider. But even when you do get people back to work, if you're going to be rotating who is and who isn't out, and of course there is the flexible furlough options that we've discussed in our previous webinar, try and keep the same groups of employees working together so that you're potentially mitigating the risk of COVID transmission. Particularly where you have furlough not all return, then, as I say, fair and transparent selection processes, invite volunteers. Obviously, you only need to apply a transparent selection process if you have more volunteers than are willing to get back to work. And some businesses may have the problem that, for whatever reason, employees would soon stay at home on furlough, then come back into work, and then obviously you're going to have a fair and transparent basis for who you seek to get back to work, even if they don't want to. Remember, there's always the potential that employees that are unhappy about being on furlough or being forced off furlough might raise grievances. They might say, if you don't have fair and transparent selection, that you're acting in an unreasonable manner that breaches the implied term of trust and confidence, or they may assert unlawful discrimination if the selection process they consider was unfair, or took into account impermissible reasons such as an employee's health, fact of pregnancy, etc. So certainly you need to be careful where you're making your decisions around employees who are clinically vulnerable and or pregnant in terms of bringing them back off furlough. So really, thanks, and I'm more than happy to take questions. So I'm more than happy to take questions. If you just introduce yourself, shout out, and I'll do my best to answer any questions that you may have. If you are going to ask questions, just remember to unmute your sound. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you very much. It's you have very well explained, especially for vulnerable and extremely vulnerable category, that how we should be returning back, and that's very helpful.
Good, thank you.
Just a comment.
Can you hear me?
I can. Sorry, who's
hi.
Hi, who's speaking?
Hi. It's Alison. Could you just go over the pregnant workers again, please? I know you said that they can come into work, yeah, but we just got to be even more vigilant where they're concerned if they want to come into work. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they are in the clinically vulnerable group. Obviously, if they can work from home, ideally they should. If you either need them back in work or they want to come into work, then employers have always had a specific obligation to do a specific pregnancy-related risk assessment, and that's always been the case. And obviously, you have to do a COVID risk assessment as part of the pregnancy risk assessment. And so really you need to be looking at the possibility, can that role be done socially distant, etc., etc. And you need to ensure that you have a safe system of work for somebody who is clinically vulnerable as a pregnant employee. The practical problem that you have if you can't establish a safe system of work, then normally what happens in that situation, it doesn't happen very often, but if, for example, you can imagine there are quite dangerous workplaces for pregnant employees, then if you can't provide a safe place of work or deploy them to a suitable alternative role that is safe, then an employee should be medically suspended on pregnancy grounds, which means that they have to be paid in full. Now, what employers need to be careful about here is they're not making the decisions around unfurloughing and furloughing based upon the fact of pregnancy, and because obviously furlough is a subsidised scheme and means that the employer isn't having to pay out 100%, but obviously the employee may be losing out financially. So you should be basing your furlough decisions around the fact that the employee may be at greater risk if they return to work either. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. It's just we have an employee who's a pregnant worker and she wants to come back to it because it's better for her. And, you know, we have had health and safety done, etc. But we would need to do a specific COVID health and safety review.
Yeah, and it's really about ensuring that enhanced element of social distancing. I mean, lots of people do want to come back into work because part of what they enjoy about work is their social interaction. And, you know, particularly, you know, some people have people at home and it's less lonely, and some people are on their own at home and want to come into work, or it's just difficult to work at home. I mean, for example, although I'm working at home, I'm actually in the office today, 4 days a week I'm at home, and I've got building work going on at the minute. So, you know, there are lots of reasons why people might want to be working in the workplace. It's just about mitigating those risks. And obviously there are potentially greater risks, or guidance being given, there are potentially greater risks for employees that are pregnant.
Sure. And can I just ask you one more quick question if it's not taking too much of your time?
No, that's fine. I'm okay for a good 5 to 10 minute chat.
Okay. If we have an employee that is in none of the positions where they're vulnerable, or they have with vulnerable, their care or anything to vulnerable people, and there's no reason why they shouldn't come in, apart from being anxious, which obviously is something that we will take into account, and we do take into account. We take mental health very seriously. What will we do if they say they don't want to come in? I mean, if we had somebody that has been invited back into the workplace because the health and safety has been undertaken and it's deemed very safe to come back to work, if they're still really anxious about it, what should we do about that?
I mean, on the assumption that they can't be accommodated to work from home. And I'm sorry, Alison. What's your what sector are you in?
BPW.
Oh, sorry, Alison. Yeah, yeah. I mean, potentially your office base. So, you know, I particularly given that the guidance is, if you can, is still actually in sectors such as ours, that if you can work from home, you should. I would be saying that it would be difficult to justify pushing it. And really, what is your rationale for saying that they must work in the office, given the guidance? I mean, that I would be quite concerned. For example, I mean, there may be certain sectors in like manufacturing that reopened, for example, where clearly that couldn't be done at home, and the employee may not have good cause to return to work. May not even have a good cause to return to work, then potentially, yes, an employer could take disciplinary action in that situation to say you're not willing to attend work. I would be probably advising, even in that situation, that businesses should be probably offering unpaid leave rather than going down the route of trying to dismiss somebody in that situation. Because I just think we don't know strictly really how tribunals are going to deal with this. I mean, obviously it's some way off before a tribunal around these kind of issues will get into the employment tribunal, because you know, I'm dealing with live cases that I know not being dealt with before March next year. So the ones that start now probably won't be dealt with till June, August next year. But certainly, I think
it's only the obvious. It's just that we're obviously looking at phasing people back into the workplace, but still within all of the social distancing guidelines and following our health and safety instructions and things, and whether or not it's reasonable or unreasonable for somebody to sort of, if we do get somebody that says, no, I don't have to come back into work because the government says I don't need to, even though we put everything into place to make sure they're safe, it's still better to say to them, well, continue to work from home, is it?
I think so for you, particularly. I think that might change when the guidance changes away from if you can work from home, you should. I think the trouble is if they have been working from home, and they've obviously been working from home, as long as they've been being effective, then I think it's difficult to say if they're anxious about returning to work, you must, particularly for those of us who are working in office-based environments.
Okay, and if the capacity for their work is not as good working from home, but would be better office space because of their system, is that irrelevant? Is that something that?
I think we're certainly still a little bit early, but you need to start managing them around the fact that they're not working at full capacity and trying to ascertain why, if there is enough work for them to do, and the facilities are there for them to be able to do everything that they should be able to do from home.
Right. Okay. All right. That's great. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Nope. It's been very good. Thank you.
No,
Thank
pleasure.
you. Very well explained.
Thank you. Well, have a good day, everybody.
you.
Hope to join you again. And if anybody needs any legal support, please do not hesitate to contact me.